later today. So what can you expect from us today? Well, first things first is let's just go through a quick piece of housekeeping. Your microphones should be on mute, and I think I've locked them so you can't unmute them. But I would ask you just to make sure you leave your microphones on mute. Please ask any questions as we go along through the chat box, and we'll pick those up at the end. And finally, as I said, this webinar is being recorded and it will come up on the Mesh Energy YouTube channel later today. For those of you on YouTube, Meshwork is the Mesh Energy social network, and it's a great place to find out more about all kinds of sustainable building. So if you're into sustainable building, sustainable design, then head over to Meshwork. It's free to join, and there will be lots of other like-minded people on there for you to speak to. So what will we cover today? Well, the basics of electric vehicle charging, what it does, how it works, and why you should actually have an electric vehicle charging point at your home or in your office. And we'll look a little bit at some of the definitions and terminology that go alongside it. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the tech. So what are charging points, the different connector types that you may come across, and a little bit about load curtailment. Then we'll look at some of the regulation and some of the grants that go alongside. So that is most specifically approved document S, which is the new part of the building regulations that will come into force in June. Then a little bit about the 2 OLEV grants, which is the Office for Low Emission Vehicles grants. And then finally a little bit about the permissions you need from your distribution network operator, the DNO, for the electrical side. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the key points about electric vehicle charging, some of the takeaways, how to find out a little bit more, and then there'll be the time for questions at the end. So this, as I say, should take about 20 minutes to go through, and that will set you up nicely to have your sandwich and then get back to work at around sort of 12:30. So what is an electric vehicle charging point? Well, fundamentally, it is a dedicated electrical socket for charging an electric vehicle. And they're slightly different from the normal plugs you get in your house, but they vary in power and design depending on where they are and what sort of electricity supply they will be able to give. Most commonly in a domestic setting or in a small commercial setting, you would probably find a 7 kilowatts AC electric vehicle charging point. And these are quite small, and they usually go on the outside of a building or maybe in the garage, and you just simply run a cable from that into your car and that will charge your car up. So how long does it take to charge a car? Well, it very much depends upon the type of car and the size of the battery. But typically, because electric vehicles are charged when they're not in use, rather than a conventional combustion engine vehicle where you drive it to a petrol station to fill it up, you've got to think about it in a slightly different way. So you tend to charge them when they're not in use. So charging time isn't quite as much of an issue in real life as people who don't have an electric vehicle tend to think. But if for a sort of standard 7 kilowatt fast charger, you'd be looking at a charging rate, as I say, of 7 kilowatts. So for a typical sort of 40 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf, you'd be looking to get a full charge from empty in about 6 hours. But of course, it's very rare you're actually going to charge your electric vehicle from empty, because you're going to top it up little and often as you go through your day. Rapid chargers, which are the bigger, chunkier chargers you'd find at motorway services and bus stations and similar locations, they will give you a much faster charge, and that will equate to about 100 miles of range in 35 minutes. So you stop at your motorway services, pop in, get your cup of tea and a sandwich, and by the time you come out, you've got enough charge for another 100 miles. So why have an electric vehicle charging point at your home or office? Well, basically, it's to give you all the upsides of electric vehicle ownership with none of the potential downsides. It allows you to top up little and often, and therefore maximize the range that's available to you at any given time. It keeps the charge cost low because you're effectively paying for your electricity at your normal electrical rate, and that is much, much cheaper than buying petrol or diesel from the fuel pump. You can obviously use any surplus that your PV system, so if you've got a PV system on the roof of your house, if you've got any surplus energy coming from that, when you're at home, you can plug your electric vehicle in, and that will allow you to use that surplus energy rather than exporting it back to the electricity grid. And increasingly, we're going to find that it's actually going to be mandated by the building regulations that you will need to install electric vehicle charging points. So it might be that it's not actually even a choice for you, that it's something you're obliged to do. So let's get a little bit more into the tech. So this is a typical electric vehicle charging point. This is a Zappi. This is the one that probably I specify more often than anything else, made by a company called My Energy. And it's just a machine that supplies electricity to your electric vehicle. Some electric vehicle charging points supply AC electricity. That's typically the smaller domestic and light commercial ones. And then the larger charging points, such as those you find at motorway services, supply DC electricity. So DC electricity can be fed straight into the battery. AC electricity has to be converted into DC by the onboard charger within the car, and then that's what charges the battery. They can come in a range of different power outputs, and again, depending upon the location, more commercial settings will tend to have a bigger electricity supply, so will have a higher power output. And they have different plugs and connectors to suit the different applications, but typically, most electric vehicle charging points will be compatible with most cars in one way or another, even if you need to have a little converter or something. So here's a picture of a sort of typical home installation. This is an Anderson EV A2 charging point on the wall here, and you've got your cable running out to plug in through a Type 2 connector into the back of this. I think it's a Tesla probably. And this is the type of charging point you're going to see most commonly in your day-to-day life. 7 kilowatt single phase supply to it, so that's a 32 amp breaker in your distribution board. And the other alternative is if you've got a 3-phase supply, then you can triple that up, so you have a 3 by 32 amp supply, and that gives you 22 kilowatts. And that's what you'd have typically in a more commercial setting, such as maybe an office development, that kind of place. As I said, the onboard charger within the car converts that AC electricity into DC, and that's what charges the battery. And there's 2 common connector types. The one that almost all new electric vehicles come with now is the Type 2, which can take up to 7 kilowatts. And it also does the 3-phase 22 kilowatt. Some older vehicles, I think the Mark 1 Nissan Leaf had the Type 1 connector, which only is capable of working with a single-phase supply. So that's an older technology now, and the Type 2 is what you typically find on almost all new vehicles. So then you've got the big boys, the DC charging points, and we're not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about that today. The DC charging points are much more for sort of commercial installs, and would typically be used on a sort of pay-as-you-go type basis at motorway services. But these are rapid chargers, and they charge the battery very, very quickly, but they do require a huge electrical supply to them. They will always have tethered cables, so you won't be having to plug a cable into them. They will come with a big chunky cable that lives attached to the charger. And typically, they have these 3 types of connector. So there's the 3 different types you'll see there. Other than Tesla, the CHAdeMO charging cable is probably the most common out of those. So let's talk a little bit about load curtailments. This is something that's very important in a typical domestic setting. So what load curtailment is your typical house will have a 60 or 100 amp electricity supply available to it from the electricity distribution network operator. And what they do is they'll have a fuse that's rated to either that 60 or 100 amps, and that protects the installation from drawing too much current. Now, clearly, if you put an electric vehicle charging point in and that's capable of drawing 32 amps, that could be more than half of the total amount of electricity your house can draw at any one time. And if you've got, for example, electric cooking, maybe some electric heating, and maybe a heat pump, maybe an electric shower, those are all quite high users of electricity, and that's before you add on things like lighting, your plugs around the house for your laptops and all those kind of things. So that is, so there could be a situation where adding an electric vehicle charging point potentially could overload your electrical system in your house on a fairly regular basis. So this is where load curtailment comes in, and what load curtailment does is that it limits the amount of electricity that the electric vehicle charging point can draw at any one time by monitoring continuously how much electricity is being taken from the grid, and then it ramps the electric vehicle charging point up and down to make sure that it always stays within the limit that the grid can provide. And that's just simply programmed in through the software into the electric vehicle charging point, and it just ramps the amount of electricity made available to the car continuously to make sure that you don't end up with an overload situation. You can also sometimes set them so they will have a fixed set point as well, so that they simply won't draw more than a certain amount of energy. But quite why you'd want to do that in most domestic situations or light commercial situations is slightly beyond me. So that's sort of one element of control. The second element of control is more around timing and optimizing the system. So you'll see here the sort of typical screen from the My Energy app. So My Energy make the Zappi charging point that I showed you earlier. And this shows you all the sources of electricity coming into this central point and then what's going where. So this can be used to manage the load curtailment, but also it could be used to optimize what your PV is doing. So in this case, we've got a 3.6 kilowatt input from our PV going into a central point. Now 1.4 kilowatts of that is going out to charge some sort of home battery. There's an amount of 1.8 kilowatts going out to feed our electric vehicle charging point. 200 watts is going out to some sort of electrical water heating. And then 200 watts is going out to charge it to all the other electrical devices around the house. And that kind of control in real time is really useful for people so they can manage how they charge their vehicle to keep it as economical as possible. So let's look at that in a bit more practice with a more simple system where we've just got solar PV and an electric vehicle charging point. So there's effectively 3 different modes available to the householder in this situation. So let me just go back one. So the first mode, the car will charge as quickly as it possibly can using all available electricity. So that means it will import from the mains, it will import from, it will use anything that's available from the solar PV, but it won't look at the economics. It will just get the vehicle charged as quickly as possible. And that might be useful, especially at night, for example, if you know you've got a long journey to make in the morning, you know you want the car to be fully charged first thing in the morning. You're obviously not going to get very much from your solar PV overnight. Moonlight doesn't tend to be very effective with solar panels. So you're going to want to charge that vehicle as quickly as you can. The second mode is a mix mode where you use some electricity from the mains and some from the solar PV. So what it will do is it will prioritize the solar PV, but it will maintain a certain level of charging. In the case of the Zappi, it's 1.4 kilowatts. And if the 1.4 kilowatts is available from the PV, it will just use the PV. If more than 1.4 kilowatts is available from the PV, then it will use more than 1.4 kilowatts. But if 1.4 kilowatts isn't available from the PV, it will make up to 1.4 kilowatts from the mains. And then the third mode is the most economic of all. And what the third mode does is it waits until there is 1.4 kilowatts available from the PV, and then it will charge the car, and it will stop charging the car when the PV falls below 1.4 kilowatts. And that is obviously the slowest, potentially the slowest way of charging the vehicle, but is also the most economic. And so by the user choosing which mode they want to be in on any given day, they can ensure their vehicle is fully charged when they want it to be charged, but also they can do it in the most economical way possible, making the best use of their solar PV array. So let's get on to the boring red tape bit. So approved document S, which will come into force on the 15th of June 2022, has brand new requirements because it's an update to the, it supports an update to the building regulations. And basically what it says is, if you build a new house, you must provide an electric vehicle charging point for every dwelling. If you have a new or substantially altered commercial building, then you need to have one electric vehicle charging point for every 10 non-residential parking spaces. And the last thing is that it also has provisions in it requiring cable routes to be pre-installed to give additional capacity upgrade in the future. So that means having conduits potentially already run into the ground, so you can easily run cables in. But there's quite a lot of requirements. But basically, if you're thinking about building a house or building a new building or substantially altering a building, from the 15th of June 2022, you are going to need to think quite seriously about electric vehicle charging points and what level of electric vehicle charging you need to provide. This isn't a choice. This is now that's going to be, part of the regulation. So how can we get some money for doing this? Well, there's a couple of different schemes available. One is the electric vehicle home charge scheme. Now that closes for homeowners of single unit properties at the end of next month, same day as the domestic RHI ceases to be. And to qualify for that, the electric vehicle charging point needs to be installed by that date. However, the EVHS does stay open for homeowners who have a flat and for people in rented accommodation beyond that date. So, it's not all is not lost, and especially if you're in rented accommodation or if you're in a flat, then it's worth, it's well worth looking at this scheme, because it can give you up to £350 off the cost of installing an electric vehicle charging point. And typically the cost of the whole installation would be around about £1,000. It is possible to claim for up to 2 vehicles per household as long as they are in concurrent use. So if you and your partner both have an electric vehicle, then you can claim for 2 charging points through this scheme. 2 caveats. One is that you must have you must use an eligible electric vehicle charging point, and the other one is that you must use an OLEV approved installer. Commercially, there's the Workplace Charging Scheme, WCS, which similarly gives up to £350 per charge point. You can claim for up to 40 charge points across all your sites, and it's open to all kinds of businesses, charities, public sector, etc., etc. Again, you have to use OLEV approved charge points, and you must use an OLEV approved installer. I'll skip over the time of use electrical tariffs, but needless to say, it's worth thinking about. If you have cheap electricity at different times of day, then it might be worth charging your car when it's cheapest. It's a bit of a no-brainer. Again, most electric vehicle charging points, you can set that up in the software, so that you get benefit from the cheapest possible electricity to charge your car. And finally, DNO permissions. So permission or notification is required for all electric vehicle charging points. You have to tell the electricity company that you're putting an electric vehicle charging point in. And there's different restrictions depending on the size of the installation. Okay, well, that's our 20 minutes has flown by. So here are the top 5 considerations, the top 5 things to take away with you from this. So number 1 is think about your electricity supply. Do you need to have low curtailments to make sure you don't overload your existing electrical supply? Take advantage of grants that might be available to you, either through the electric vehicle home charge scheme or through the workplace charging scheme. Talk to your DNO. They'll be very helpful in most cases, and make sure that they have given you all the relevant permissions, or you've given them the relevant information at the correct times. Make sure that if you have got PV, that you buy an intelligent charger that works with your PV to maximize your self-consumption. And if you can, use a time of use electricity tariff to maximize the savings that you can make. So just before we go on to questions, I'll just talk to you a little bit about the company I work for, which is Mesh Energy. So we are an independent energy consultancy. We're based in Farnham in Surrey, and our role is very much to simplify the sustainable energy landscape for people around the country, and potentially even further afield. And what we do is that at all the REBA stages, from stage 1 all the way through the project, all the way through to post-occupancy evaluation, we will work with architects, clients, in order to sort of give you that level of service and that level of self-belief in the project that you're doing, and try and give you the smoothest possible journey to a successful, sustainable project. Okay, any questions, please pop them into the chat box and I will do my best to answer them. So, who is going to be the first person brave enough to put a question into the chat? Nobody. I've covered everything. Fantastic. Oh, here we go. Tom, I have one. Excellent. Far away, Tom. Okay, so Tom's question is, would there ever be a scenario where the electrical supply doesn't allow an increased draw? It is in practice quite unlikely. I haven't come across it certainly in a domestic setting. And for smaller installations, it's actually only a requirement to inform rather than to get permission, so they can rebalance their just make sure their network is balanced. So in most cases, no. I suspect if you were doing a particularly large commercial installation, and I haven't been directly involved in any of those, that there may be a bit more back and forth about network reinforcement. So if you were trying to put in several Tesla superchargers, for example, at a motorway service station, then it's probably a slightly different conversation. But for your typical domestic installation, I haven't ever seen that as an issue. Next question is, with PVs, you never seem to use the electric as people are out all the way. Is there any progress in terms of batteries? So there's a few things. Obviously, there's a lot more people working at home now since the pandemic. Obviously, working patterns have changed quite a bit, and there's a lot more hybrid working. In terms of batteries, yes, battery storage at home is definitely more of a thing, and as electricity prices are shooting up at an ever increasing rate, it is becoming more and more economically viable to have have battery storage at home. It does, whether it's economically viable for you is very dependent upon your personal circumstances and your personal consumption patterns and the PV array that you have on your house. But yeah, I can also refer you to a video we did, one of the Mesh ones, which is the battery storage masterclass, which I think was done in the middle of last year sometime. So if you look back on our YouTube channel, there is lots and lots about battery storage on there. Great. Well, if there are no more questions, then I will thank you very much for your time. Sneaked it in under the sort of magic half hour, including questions. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again on a future one. Cheers. Bye-bye.